Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I wish you a warm welcome to our international conference dealing with the past. This conference takes place, as you've already seen, quite differently than we planned it originally. In normal circumstances, we would now be in the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy at the Gendarmenmarkt, and we would be looking forward to 2 days of exchange and discussion. Due to Corona, this is not possible. Again, we've got participants from very different countries and continents in order to discuss how after war violence or dictatorships people can deal with the crimes that happened, how transitional justice, Germany also uses the word Aufarbeitung, reconciliation. So how transitional justice can be organized in a way that dealing with the past can lead to a non-violent present. The expectations to these processes are very high. The victims expect justice and recognition of what happened to them, what the state did to them. But they are not the only ones who expect that the offenders are convicted. Large parts of the population observe how offenders and those responsible are being dealt with, whether their crimes are being hushed up, whether there are attempts to bring the past to light. The legitimacy of the power depends also on the question of how these questions are dealt with. And in the end, the question is whether there is the political will to answer individual and societal expectations to establish justice and to bring the truth to light. It is very important to see who expects what and what is the goal of a reconciliation for the victims and those concerned. It is the truth about the past, very often connected to a moral and factual rehabilitation. This concerns particularly those who were the victims of state violence. To them, transitional justice means justice and means to get their rights back. For others, the aspect of reconciliation is more important to groups, to parts of society, in order to make a peaceful coexistence possible. We in Germany have had to deal with 2 dictatorships in the last century, and we have to deal with things that happened with the offenders, with the victims, with the structures that were established. After the end of the Nazi dictatorship in 1945, the Nuremberg trials were the event that dealt with the crimes that happened. After the end of the communist dictatorship under Soviet rule in East Germany are being compared with other countries in order also being compared to what happened after the end of the National Socialist rule. Dealing with the Nazi crimes in Germany has become a role model for transitional justice processes worldwide. And even if we look back to the first decades, we have to acknowledge that this way of dealing with the past, even against the background of an unwilling majority of the population, was possible. Ralph Giordano, a survivor of the National Socialist regime, calls this way of dealing with the past a second guilt. Theodor Adorno, at the end of the 50s, said that large parts of the German population denied to deal with questions of crimes, of being part to crimes. What we tried after 1990 was to bring to light that reconciliation is not only a legal process, but contains very many societal and other processes. Evidence has to be established, and it has to be made possible that the whole society can deal with these processes. This includes scientists, education, public memorials, questions of mentality, and long-term impact of this experience. The German model is just one form of how different states and societies can deal with their past. The preconditions for a successful transitional justice is not only the openness of a society to deal with these sometimes even painful questions, but also a strong support from politicians, which does not mean that this support is being given just by individual parties, but a support for actors who deal regionally, nationally, locally, in the whole country. We are very glad that with the help of this conference, we can talk with you about different experiences about transitional justice from different regions. We would like to look beyond our own horizon of the German experience and see how these processes were looking like in different countries. I wish us 2 interesting days. You can ask your questions with the help of the chat. And now I would like to pass the floor to Professor Jan Eckel from the Eberhard Karls University of Tübingen. He is going to give a keynote on the topic, A Brief History of Regime Changes in the Late 20th Century, and will give us an introduction into our conference. After the keynote, he will talk to Mr. Asel of RBB Inforadio, who is going to present him in more detail. I welcome both of you warmly to our conference. But before we pass the microphone to Tübingen, to Mr. Eckel, I would like to thank the colleagues from our foundation who made this conference possible, who organized this conference a long time ahead. This is Dr. Grünbaum and Dr. Sabine Kuder, who are the heads of this department. Mr. Bauer and Mrs. Eberhard, together with them, organized the conference, even though the preconditions were very difficult. And we are looking forward to interesting discussions. We hope that the technology will work and that we will have interesting discussions. And of course, it is necessary in order to make the technology possible that we have professional technicians. This is the company Audio Sprint, and I would like to express my gratitude to the technicians. But now I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Eckel, to Tübingen. I wish you an interesting conference and a fruitful exchange. Thank you very much.
Fischer, thank you very much, first of all, for your kind words of introduction. I'd like to also thank the organizers of this conference for putting together such an interesting program. And I'd like to thank you, dear listeners, and the colleagues, and my warmest greetings to all of you. The original perspective of my brief presentation is that regime changes, when we think about the 20th century, have always played an important role. So in Western history, but not only in the West, but in the West, the symbolic dates of regime changes have played a key role, such as 1918, 1945, 1989, and 1990. My presentation now is to question this interpretation that we're all familiar with and to make it more complicated, so that afterwards I then present a proposal of how political regime changes can be interpreted historically when we look at the history of the international order from a more long-term and a global perspective. And I'd like to do this in 4 argumentative steps. So can we see the next slide, please? The first step step I'd like to take is to briefly reflect on the relationship between regime changes and historical seizures in the 20th century. And I'd like to use the year 1945 as an example. In Western historical representation, for a long time, there was the view that with the year 1945, an epoch of total war that lasted since 1914 and mass violence that was linked to this had come to an end, and that 1945 also marked the beginning of a new era, which was then characterized by the opposing pair of liberal capitalist democracies on the one hand and communism and the planned economy on the other. For European history, that idea seems sensible, especially in Germany, where the victory of the Allies led to the liberation of German society of the Nazi regime. The German population did not manage to free itself from Nazi rule, and that then opened a difficult path towards democratic reconstruction. Also, when we look at Poland, this interpretation of history also makes sense, but in a different way, because the end of the Second World War for Poland didn't just bring liberation from the German occupying force, it brought a new form of suppression in the form of Soviet rule. And if we look at the group of Ukrainians in Poland and beyond the Polish-Soviet border, again, a different image emerges. For the Ukrainians, for many of them, the struggle hadn't even come to an end. Particularly, the nationalists continued to fight for an ethnically clean, homogeneous state. It was a bloody struggle. One option was to establish Ukrainian independence. That option first became likely in the First World War, but that struggle only came to an end in 1947. If we gaze beyond Europe, the end of the Second World War is also classed as a moment of liberation in Vietnam, but not just liberation from the Japanese occupation, but it's actually seen as liberating the country from colonial rule that goes back way into the 19th century. And the Japanese occupation was always seen as a continuation of that colonial rule. You see on the slide, what you mean, a speaking act, if ever there was one. Unlike in Europe, that moment, however, passed rather quickly because almost immediately a rather long decolonization war followed, which ended only in 1954 with the two-state solution and their independence, but de facto only came to an end in 1979. And then in China, also, one war came to an end in 1945, the Japanese War, which cost up to 20 million human lives. But another war continued, which was the Civil War between the Kuomintang and the Communists, which the latter only decided for themselves in 1949. So when we take all these observations together, I believe we can see that from the perspective of a regime shift or regime changes, the year 1945 is not a singular uniform rupture. It's really multiple turning points, if you want, and that has different regional significance and even opposing significance in different regions and countries. My second argument, my second approach would be to ask why we think that these system changes are so important for periodization of the 20th century. And it seems to me that the prominence of these turning points is also a historical product of the 20th century. Not only, but it's an extension, if you like, of the experiential perspective into historical interpretation. This becomes clear when we see that apparently the 20th century came to an end with the collapse of communism in Eastern and Central Europe. Francis Fukuyama pressed forward with this thought in his book called End of History. he turned it into an extreme, so to speak, by declaring that history itself had reached its inner telos. From today's perspective, that book appears as evidence of the inability to perceive other problems of humanity other than the system conflict of the Cold War, even though these other problems, of course, have always existed all the way through. But more subtle and historically elaborated interpretations also shared this thought. Erich Hobsbawm, for example, declared in 1995 that the short 20th century had come to an end with the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it appeared that with the collapse of communism, a historical force had disappeared that hadn't just shaped Eastern Europe to a great degree, but also the West, because it posed a systemic alternative. And also in other interpretations of the century, relics of this idea were present. This is evidence of the intellectual power of a contemporary idea, namely that system conflict, the Cold War, if you want, is the key determinant of international history of the 20th century. Next slide, please. If we now look at more recent historical research on international history, there are different possibilities of understanding the century, because many of the key developments for international development, the way we now look at them from a global perspective, follow other temporal rhythms than those that use system changes for orientation. And I just want to give you two brief examples. One is the rise of the United States to become a global formative power. That began with the dramatic industrial growth of the country at the end of the 19th century. At the end of the First World War, the United States were the biggest global power, economically, financially, military, but also in terms of its cultural influence. Until then, a decision was taken to use this potential actively, to take a globally formative role. That was a decision taken by the Roosevelt government in the Second World War, and that was a secular decision. And all the further governments, all the way to the end of the Cold War, confirmed this decision. And also after 1990, it didn't completely disappear. So that formative role, that formative power of the United States wasn't entirely lost. The two photographs you can see here on the slides are maybe a little bit too obvious. They illustrate a debate that we are leading right now, actually, today. Is Kabul the new Saigon? Question mark. There are parallels between Vietnam, maybe, the American withdrawal in 1975 and the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan right now. And that's a question that can be historically illuminated. Now, of course, we'd have to look at the differences first of all, but there are parallels in the premises of a democratic nation building that the United States, not just the US, but certainly the United States, has attempted to introduce in different locations of the global South. My second example of such long-term influential processes is the end of colonial rule, which actually took place in several pushes, if you like, and the beginning of which can also be dated to the late 19th century. That really followed the First World War. Then the criticisms, or well, really the struggles against European colonial rule took on a new quality, in particular when nationalist mass movements arose. Before then, of course, it was a rather lengthy process to actually establish independences, roughly between 1945 and the mid-1970s. That, of course, wasn't the end of colonization, depending on how broadly you interpret that term, and the repercussions of colonialism, of course, are still very present today. And again, the current debates we are leading on cultural and intellectual decolonization of Western societies also refer to that particular frame of reference. So those are just two examples that tell us that the 20th century isn't just something that began with the usual dates like 1914, 1918. And it may actually be much more plausible to understand that century in terms of phases of change rather than systemic shifts. My examples point to the significance of the late 19th century and the 1920s as formative phases. But with those, another thought becomes more prominent, namely that the 1970s are also a very important kind of hinge in that century. And again, I want to just give you one example. The beginning of the end, so to speak, of communist rule in Eastern Europe can also be traced back to the 1970s, because there we had that economic downturn, which couldn't be stopped ultimately. New synergies began to arise between internal and external criticism. And this is when Eastern European societies began to open enough them to recognize Western life standards as a desirable goal. And last not least, the generation of reformers was politically socialized, those that then took political decisions later in the 1980s. All that, however, does not mean that political regime shifts in the 20th century were insignificant. That leads me to the last slide. That, of course, would not make sense at all. It does, however, mean to rethink a little more carefully where the historical place of regime shifts might be, where we might situate those. And I want to leave you with three ideas. Firstly, it seems important to me to emphasize the experiential dimension of regime changes, because the pure regime change often created new framework conditions, but it was embedded in much broader, more formative developments that brought with them the fact that societies didn't just begin their lives from scratch in a kind of tabula rasa. But in the experiential horizon, these moments of regime change, moments of liberation, for example, of course, retained their significance, their symbolism, like liberations, for example. You can see that on the photograph here. Second, I would argue that it wasn't necessarily specific points of regime change in countries that influenced the international history of the 20th century. It was actually multiple phases, so different caesuras, if you like, which, however, took place in close interrelationship. You can see this when looking at developments around 1918, around 1945, and also around 1989. And thirdly, regime changes point us to the significance of the sheer eventness of the 20th century. And here I want to give you a last example. Again, it's the Soviet Union. In the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was economically destroyed. But the end of communist, that needn't have meant the end of communist rule. And nobody expected it to spell the end of communist rule. The end of communism only became possible through the reform initiatives of the politicians around Gorbachev. So it was the interplay also of civil society then using those rooms for maneuver they suddenly had, that suddenly popped open. So the perspective of system changes, I believe, is a corrective against too stringent, too deterministic historical interpretations, because it emphasizes the role of contingency, but it also points us to the significance of human agency in such large-scale processes. I'll leave it there and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eckel, for
Vortrag, der uns mal versucht hat, deutlich zu machen, was wir, wenn
introduction, which made it very clear what we can mean when we talk about upheavals and system changes. This conference very strongly looks for how democratization processes take place and can be sustainable. But we also realized that in parallel, many things happen that can go into very many different directions. And I would like to come back to these three steps about changes, turning points, and system shifts. Turning points are the points that historians try to point out. And you rightly said that if you look back at an event less than 10 years after it happened, then after 30 years, you realize that you might have been wrong. At the same time, turning points are not at the end because changes are being perceived by people. The long processes you mentioned, as for example, the rise of the US, are being perceived both by the actors and those concerned by history, not in the way that they are perceived later. So which role do such processes play in the understanding of those who participate in them? I believe that the most important thing is to differentiate two things that you have mentioned too. The question how an historical event is being perceived by those participating and how it is then perceived in the historical perspective. And we have to say that historians, at least as I can see it, tend to look at systems that are being perceived as a shift by those participating are rather perceived as something that happens in a longer course of time. So we have somehow to contradict the thought that everything is new because we think that we are the first who experience it. So I think that in short, we are going to perceive the 11th of September 2001 in a different way than we do today. And although I share this way of thinking, and although I also try to think about the last century in such a way, I think that these system changes are still very important in the perception of history, because for those who participated, who lived at that time, these changes have a large impact on their lives. And this is something that we would like to discuss on this conference, because the act of a regime change, which we usually understand as the change towards something positive, in fact, open up new leeway, new perspectives, and this is something that we have to take seriously. My Potsdam colleague Martin Sabro differentiates turning points in the perception and turning points in the interpretation. And my thesis, the thesis of my keynote, was that we have to take into account the turning point for the personal experience much more, because they might have a much larger impact. So if people say this was more or less the day when I lost my fear against the state's power, this does not necessarily have to be identical with the date that we journalists usually remind of. That would be the more individual perspective. I also realized that you tried to use a very neutral term, shift or change. We are used to use such terms as revolution, liberation, or democratization. Are these different changes or shifts so close to each other that we really can use a neutral term to comprise them all? I think that only a neutral term can comprise all of these processes. And I use the Polish example because if we look at 1945 and if we look at which people belonged to which groups and were living at that time and what the end of the war meant to these different groups, this becomes obvious. We can even use the extreme example of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust who still after the liberation of the concentration camps lost their lives during pogroms. These were several hundreds. That means that I believe for a more complex historical understanding, it is very important to see that very many different things happened in parallel. And this is the only way of understanding such a multifaceted and complex thing. And this also has to do with the processes of restitution, of reconciliation, of the culture of remembrance and of justice, things that we are talking about at this conference. I think this is the only way of approaching a certain way of making a majority happy with thinking about their past. On the one hand, we have different ways of experiencing things, but on the other hand, we also try in a normative way to elaborate a certain way of understanding that legitimates a regime change in the past, because otherwise each power shift, be it a military one or a civil one, which brought about a system change, would have the same meaning. If you look back at the 20th century, you said that many different things happened in parallel and enforced each other. Where do you see differences between a mere change of elites and a real opening towards a participation of larger parts of society? I think that the differences are very large, and I tried to make it clear that I don't want to make things equal or to present different kinds of regime changes as equally. This would be wrong. Of course, it is a large difference for many people, whether they lived under a fascist dictatorship or in a communist dictatorship or in a democracy or under colonial rule. That would be far too much if we said that these things were all the same. A neutral term allows us to elaborate the differences more thoroughly. And if we look at the 20th century from this angle, we can see very many differences. Let us try to look at the American history of their regime change, and we can see that if we compare it to German history or to Japanese history, then the process of democratization there was very different from what happened in America, and what happened during the Cold War was very different in the different parts of the world. If we look at the occupational planning of the US during the Iraq War or after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, then you can see that this might even remind you of colonial plannings in the 19th century, where there was practically no knowledge about regional structures, about local structures. And it turned out that it was impossible to create a new society without knowing local conditions. The historian who deals with contemporary history has to deal with very recent events, as we can see in the recent days when we look at Afghanistan. You said that these changes did not take partially in the individual countries, but everything is connected to each other. Could you give us some more examples of how things impacted each other, how impulses were passed, how people were brave enough to support change processes in their country? Yes, I think the regime changes around 1990, which started around 75 and lasted until the middle 90s, are a good example. And historical science is trying to understand how the different ways of the exchange of experience, of the orientation towards the past is influencing each other. The Polish elites in the late 80s were researching the Franco dictatorship of the 70s because they thought that the Franco elites were able to secure high-ranking positions in the new system. Maybe this is a connection that sounds a bit surprising to us, but it exists. And apart from that, the whole Eastern Bloc, the movement of dissidents was a very communicative one. There was a very much exchange. There were contacts to Western peace movements, which, on the other hand, were very conflictual ones, because the peace movement said that we want, first and foremost, that a third world war can be prevented, and that is why we would ask you dissidents to be less active, because maybe your actions can lead to a third world war. We can also look at China. China learned from the Soviet perestroika how not to react. The Chinese leadership was much more interested in opening their country in economic terms, but they did not want the things to happen that happened in the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, that is, that the political system crashed. And until today, they succeeded in supporting a very rigid political system and combine it with a capitalist economy. You pointed out that such processes and changes are connected to single events. And fortunately, our audience can participate in our conference via mail or chat. And the question was asked, if we look at such change processes, which role do non-violent movements play and personalities? The buzzword that was sent to us via mail was Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. So the question, how individual people as charismatic figures participated, and maybe interests were grouped around them. Yes, definitely. This is a very well-known dynamics that starts from individual persons. You named some of them. And by the way, we can observe that such things are passed and develop further over the generations. Mahatma Gandhi is named over the whole course of the 20th century in very different contexts. And he has become a symbol of nonviolence resistance. And Martin Luther King has a similar role. And particularly in the 60s, there are very many parallels between the Afro-American liberation movement and the process of decolonialization. I also named other persons like Gorbachev, Lech Wałęsa, Václav Havel. And Václav Havel, for example, was a person who stood up for what they supported and were even arrested for their convictions. Nelson Mandela is another example. He was imprisoned for many decades, but still, after he was liberated, supported a peaceful change of the regime. And even though his enemies thought that an old man would leave the prison and would like to take revenge. Such personalities have a very emotional impact, and this is an impact that rulers are very often afraid of. And that is why the leaders of protest movements are being imprisoned very often, as we can see today.
Es geht weiter hier. Ich muss gar nicht auf meine Sachen schauen. Es geht weiter hier mit den Mails. Sie haben
Hey, we continue with the emails. You said in your presentation the East-West conflict was perceived as has been overly emphasized as the determining conflict of the 20th century. That means other conflicts need to be taken into account more strongly than we do now. Which exact conflicts would those be? Which ones ought we to look at more? Yes, I would say that this is an important shift in how we perceive the second half of that century. And I think the more you think about it and the more closely you delve into conflicts in that second half of the century, the more you'll note that these are very multi-dimensional constructs, really, multi-dimensional conflicts. So we could actually pick out any conflict of the Cold War. Let's pick the Korea War, 1950 to 1953, which was one of the important catalysts of the Cold War. And rightly so, but it isn't just a disagreement between the Soviet Union and the United States. It actually connects to an internal Korean struggle, which breaks open in the moment when the Japanese occupational force, which goes back to colonization in 1905, comes to an end. So all of a sudden, it's Korean actors who themselves try to shape their future. And of course, they have very different ideas as to what that future should be. The war is begun by Kim Il-sung. It's not the Soviet Union, not China, not the United States. The domestic Korean Civil War is an important dimension for those 3 years, which influences that Cold War conflict hugely. So wherever we look, whether it's Central America in the mid-80s or African conflicts in the 60s, whether it's Southern Asian conflicts like Vietnam in the 70s, everywhere, we note that very often decolonization dynamics are becoming linked to the Cold War, but also ethnic struggles, political struggles, power struggles. For example, the struggles for access to post-colonial states. That means the more you let yourself delve into that, we say Vietnam, Korea, Cuba, that's another example. These aren't just, the stages where the Cold War happens. These are their own players, active agents in this Cold War. So that makes clear that we are looking at different strands of conflict. Decolonization is probably the most important one if we try to weight them a little bit, but it goes all the way to transnational attempts at intervention based on human rights or humanitarian aid. All that also influences conflicts. Biafra would be another example, 1967 to 1970, Chile in the 70s. So many more politologists actually come into play who draw a much more diverse picture of the second half of the 20th century. Yes, and then it's interesting to ask what reminds societies of these transitions, what does it demand of those participating respectively, and what does society do in terms of legal restitution, for example, or reconciliation. But the other direction would be, where has the East-West conflict perhaps also frozen transitions that would otherwise maybe have developed differently, maybe earlier, maybe differently, maybe not as eruptive as they then turned out to be? Yeah, I'm still wondering if the image of freezing is terribly convincing. If there is a good example for it, you would probably think of Yugoslavia, where there was a comparatively, at least a pretty okay coexistence between the different ethnicities. But I wouldn't say that the end of the Cold War was the sole reason that suddenly, a conflict like that thaws, just to stick with the image of the frozen conflict. Milosevic and other nationalist politicians, other logics, other interests come into play that somehow have been waiting for a fortuitous moment to just, take center stage, maybe. And how conflicts are interpreted in the Yugoslavia that fell apart has changed over time. Very often, reports or interpretations said, it's archaic hatred which is breaking open once again in Yugoslavia. But when you research this, you find that these are calculated stokings of conflict. But this is much more calculated, which we hear another voice all of a sudden.
Simultanübersetzung, die wir an der Stelle auch mal herzlich grüßen.
Okay, we have an echo on the line at the moment. Maybe we ought to talk some more about the frame of reference of transitions. Nations you've already referred to, but you said something in half a sentence earlier, which was part of your research, which is human rights and the development of the human rights discourse during the decades since 1945. Is it possible to differentiate between these frames of reference? Or is it also all overlaying each other?
Aber analytisch würde ich sagen, in der historischen, analytischen Rückschau muss man sie sogar trennen, weil man sonst eben nicht wirklich verstehen kann, was passiert ist. Und die Menschenrechtspolitik, sagen wir mal, gerade der 70er und 80er Jahre, wo der Menschenrechtsgedanke international einen großen Aufschwung erlebt, ist dafür, glaube ich, ein besonders gutes Beispiel. Denn insgesamt betrachtet gibt es ganz unterschiedliche Gründe, warum Aktivistinnen und Aktivisten, Politikerinnen und Politiker sich auf den Menschenrechtsgedanken beziehen und welche Ziele sie damit verfolgen. Das ist ein Teil des Kalten Krieges, etwa wenn man auf die westdeutsche Regierung blickt, die versucht, über Menschenrechtskritik an der DDR sich also sozusagen eine neue Waffe zu schmieden im Kampf gegen den deutsch-deutschen Systemgegner. Aber es gibt andere, die gar nicht den Kalten Krieg im Sinn haben, wenn sie an Menschenrechte denken, sondern ganz im Gegenteil, die Logik, diese binäre Logik, Ost gegen West, Demokratie gegen Diktatur, dieses Dichotomische überwinden wollen, indem sie sagen, es geht uns nicht um ideologische Zugehörigkeit, es geht uns nicht um politisches System. Wir wollen immer dann helfen, wenn Menschen gequält werden. Das ist im Grunde, wenn Sie so wollen, der Grundgedanke von Amnesty International. Und darüber kann man jetzt sehr viel diskutieren. Hat das geklappt, hat das nicht geklappt, ist das illusorisch oder nicht? Aber mir geht es hier um den Ansatzpunkt. Und der Ansatzpunkt besteht eben darin, zu sagen, wir möchten zu einem Begriff des Politischen kommen, der beim Menschen ansetzt und bei dem, was den Menschen quält, egal wer es macht, egal wo es stattfindet. Und das hat auch eine starke globale Blickerweiterung zur Folge. Vielleicht ist diese auch eine Voraussetzung für Menschenrechtspolitik, weil dann eben nicht nur nach Europa geblickt wird, sondern auch nicht in alle Teile der Welt, aber doch in manche, vor allen Dingen nach Südamerika, in den 70er Jahren, deutlich weniger nach Afrika. Aber immerhin, es gibt einen starken politischen Bewusstseinswandel, ein Streben nach einer neuen politischen Konfiguration, der sich für zivilgesellschaftliche Aktivistinnen und Aktivisten im Westen eben gerade an die Menschenrechtsidee heftet.
Deshalb hat ja auch jede Unterstützergruppe von Amnesty International eben nicht nur einen Menschen in Osteuropa oder in der Sowjetunion, nicht nur einen Menschen im Westen, sondern auch einen Menschen im globalen Süden parallel unterstützt. Und da sind wir jetzt eigentlich noch mal bei einem wichtigen Punkt, der auch noch mal angefragt wurde. Wir haben über die Zäsur 89/90 gesprochen. Sie haben diese Zäsur ein bisschen verschliffen, aber Sie haben sie nicht dementiert letztlich. Sie ist sehr stark. Aber ist das nicht doch die entscheidende Zäsur des Nordens, also Europa, USA, Sowjetunion und deren Satellitenstaaten? Und sind die Diskurse, die zum Beispiel den globalen Süden betreffen, nicht mit ganz anderen zeitlichen Zäsuren und mit ganz anderen Umbrüchen festzumachen? Welche Rolle spielt also das Ende des Ost-West-Konflikts für diese anderen Konflikte?
Ja, also auch hier würde ich sagen, gelten wieder beide Teile. Beide Teile.
Well, again, both parts, I would say, are important.
Das mache ich immer sehr geschickt.
Das Jahr 1989 ist
So the year 1989 certainly, maybe apart from Yemen, if my information is correct, where there was a unification of two parts of the country.
Das falsch sein sollte, ist sicherlich in wenig
Also in
Weltgegenden
1989. But please correct me if I should be wrong. It's not an immediate local turning point, but I just wanted to place 1989 and that turning point into a much broader context. But the end of the systemic conflict, of course, has repercussions for the rest of the world, because the logic that had spanned the entire world, that there was only a pro or a con, you either had to be a supporter or an opponent, that logic all of a sudden came to an end. So many authoritarian regimes in the global south, for example, then all of a sudden found themselves without any support, and that affected Latin America and the military dictatorships, but also Africa, Southern Africa, for example. There we had an anti-communist bastion, for example. So very far-reaching changes, of course, then took place. And I would completely agree when you say that for European history, the year 1989 is a very, very important event, the transformations that took place there. If we can agree that we should see this year as part of more long-term shifts that don't represent a very sudden turning point, but are really part of much longer-term streams or developments that also continue beyond that year, 1989. Okay, there's a number of questions coming in that relate to human rights discourses. The question is, how influential were they really in terms of promoting change, promoting the end of communism, for example, or the end of colonialism? We don't have that much time left, but perhaps you can attempt a brief answer. The panel that follows on, we look at different regions of the world, and I'm sure we'll come back to that question. Yes, okay, I'll try to give you a summary answer, really, which is the most difficult, but also the most interesting thing to try and do. I think that international human rights policy in the second half of the 20th century changed the policy significantly but subtly, to the degree that a new constellation arose in which at the end of the 20th century, state injustice was observed much more closely than was the case in 1950, shall we say. But also networks formed of actors who undertook a great deal in order to actively counter such injustice. So I would say it's a type of sensitization. Okay, now of course you can we must differentiate. So this is a pretty sort of global. But I would say yes, there has been a change in the 20th century because of it. Okay. Last question. A modern historian always looks at conditions just past. Which of the research fields you just referred to would you want to come back to maybe in 20 or 25 years' time, because you say we are still too close to it right now? That's probably true for every transformation, for every system change. 9/11 is one, but also probably the withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan. But One thing that I'm particularly interested in, one thing that I have been interested in for the last 15 years, what we might make of it in 20 years' time, is really that global broadening of our perspective as historians, really. A broadening that has been pretty conflict-free, actually. The work of historians has been changed fundamentally because of this. So I think that we'll also see this in the future as a historically contingent change. So ourselves, actually, we will actually be looking at ourselves differently and ask, well, how come that at the turn of the 20th century, the thought arose that we need to look at the world as a whole, that this idea became so powerful without judging this. There's definitely pros, but maybe also some cons. So we ourselves, as historians, we might be witnessing a fundamental shift that will give us much food for thought in the decades to come. But not just in terms of the global perspective, but also the rise of a term like transition, for example. I was at an exhibition a while ago, which was about the Stone Age and turning points there. We used to talk about eras, shining examples of human development, but now we are much more interested in these transformations, these turning points, and what they might do to people, to societies. Also, what demands they might bring, what societies can perhaps also demand as a result from these transitions. So, Mr. Eckel, thank you very much for your presentation and for the discussion. And we move right on, because the first coffee break.
Wir bleiben eigentlich natürlich bei dem Thema, was wir eben besprochen haben, wollen uns nun aber doch mal...
First coffee break will be only after our first panel discussion. We will stay with this topic and we would like to look at some examples which are quite far from each other locally, but still connected to each other. And we would like to include representatives of other sciences, and we would like to see what changes, in which way do things change, how do the examples from the different countries look like. How do people deal with each other after things happened, and which narratives elaborated with hindsight? And we will do this with 4 scholars. Welcome to Aurel Croissant. He is a professor of political sciences at the Ruprecht Karls University of Heidelberg, who is an expert for political processes in Southeast Asia. Professor Lentz was professor at the university in Mainz, and she's a senior professor now, and she is the director of the Goethe Institute. Her regional focus is Africa. Of course, Africa is very big. She concentrates on West Africa. Sabine Kurtenbach represents the Leibniz Institute for Global and Area Studies of Hamburg and also works at the University of Marburg and concentrates on conflict and peace research and on Latin America. And Gwendolyn Sasse, she is the director of the ZEUS, the Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin. And at the same time, she is a professor of comparative democracy and authoritarian research at the Institute of Social Sciences at the Humboldt University of Berlin. We will shortly realize that it is not always easy to compare and to elaborate parallels. But at first, I would like all 4 of you to give us 2 or 3 examples of system changes from the regions that you concentrate on, because many of these changes are very worth being looked at, and that is why 2 or 3 might even be too little. We've been talking about the East-West conflict, and that is why I would like to ask Mrs. Sasse to start with Central and Eastern Europe. As you wish. Thank you very much. I thought that I would be the last because we already talked about this, but I can start right away. The keynote was very interesting, and also the talk that you had was very interesting to me. I would like to come back to the term system change. I think this is a very large term, and I ask myself what are the limits, the limitations of this term. We political scientists look very closely at terms, but we also question them. And I think that the term system change or regime change gives rise to the question, how big does a change have to be in order to become a regime change? I think that the term can be very precise, but a system or a regime can be very different things. I would like to look at Eastern Europe, and I, of course, would like to give some more concrete examples. But to me, it is the combination of political changes, economic changes, societal changes, and the latter also includes the definition of a new state, of a nation. This is very relevant for large parts of Eastern Europe since 1989 and 90. And I think the term upheaval can be compared to the term revolution. This seems to be one moment, but you already said that the term also includes long-term impacts and consequences, but also things that happened before a certain moment. And I also think that the most important thing is what happened before a regime change or before an upheaval, and has a large impact on how it really looked like. I would like to give the example that was already named, the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I would like to approach it on the level of different parts of the Soviet Union. I don't want to talk about a system conflict between East and West, which already was part of the discussion earlier. Some things were already mentioned. I think that when we look at such events as the ones that happened in 1989, and I would like to talk about 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. We can briefly discuss the processes that happened in Central and Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union on the other hand. And this year we witness the anniversary of this collapse, the 30th anniversary of this collapse. And I think that it is a very good example that shows that the moment of the dissolution was a very quiet one. The most interesting things were the ones that happened before and, of course, things that happened after this moment. But very many things that happened around 1991 and many expectations did not become true. One example, we heard very often that the collapse of the Soviet Union can be compared to the collapse of other empires and that it was relatively peaceful. Probably relatively is a good way of describing it, because if we look at the war in Ukraine and at the fact that Russia occupied parts of the Ukraine in 2014 and annexed Crimea, then we see that these are parts of the legacy of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the fact that borders can be shifted in the center of Europe is part of this upheaval, of this change, and it would not have been expected in 1991. This is also an example. Ukraine is a good example because it was part of the change system and the change processes in the 1990s. And it shows that diversity plays a large role in these processes. We have to pay attention to this diversity. System change or system shift sounds to me as if these processes were similar in all parts of the Soviet Union. And this was also the way of how these things were perceived for a long time. If we think of the thesis of Fukuyama, then from the perspective not only of Western Europe, but also of other parts of the world, we have to pay attention to the differences in the Eastern Bloc. I think that many Western Europeans did not see how many differences existed in Central and Eastern Europe. And I think the same pertains to the post-colonial areas. So Ukraine is an example of a state that in 1991 became independent, declared itself as independent within the borders it also perceives as its borders today, including Crimea. It had to face many challenges, and these challenges were, for example, different from the challenges of Poland, which was independent earlier and lost its independence several times in the course of the centuries. And we can also see the consequences of these developments today. Ukraine is also an example of how even after 1991, political reforms and mobilizations also of the masses took place, as in 2004, 2013 and 14. These processes oriented at other processes in other regions, in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, but also developed their own dynamics. So I would say that there is a dilemma. If we just look at one region, then still we have to put it into the context of global history. And very often, such ways of looking at things are perceived very suspiciously because maybe they are too specific. But I think it is important to look at local features. Can I name two other examples? Do I still have enough time? Yes, please do. I would like to look at the Russian Federation, and I would like to point out the interesting dynamics that the center of a former empire, the Soviet Union, was participating in the system change at the beginning, and later the Russian Federation also became an independent state, but the first phase of the change is perceived by large parts of the population as very negative, because this was a time of chaos. Democracy, the term democracy, didn't get any content. The capitalism which emerged was a predatory capitalism, and an authoritarian regime was established that lasts until today under President Putin. And this regime is very similar to the Soviet regime in terms of rhetoric, in terms of its structure. So this change has led to a very different a system that is not that different from the one it started from. And a third example is Belarus and the developments that took place there, particularly since last summer. Thank you very much. We are going to talk about what meaning these changes have for the societies. You named Poland as an example, and Polish history is being discussed very controversially in the Polish society. And today's political parties discuss these questions very controversially. And the question is whether we should rather take the perspective of human rights when we look at Polish developments. We looked about empires and about their dissolution. When we talk about decolonialization, there are many different aspects and things we have to take into account. There is not one Africa, and even French-speaking countries in Africa can look back at very different developments of the last century. So the former colonies, both of France and of Great Britain, developed very differently. Carola, Lentz, you focus on West Africa, and I was told that there are parts in other regions of this large continent as well that you would like to point out. Yes, thank you very much. I would like to come back to the question that you asked earlier. And what Jan Eckel also mentioned. Of course, we can take the example of decolonialization. An African public would rather speak about the process of becoming independent or the day of independence. And this is definitely a turning point in the interpretation. And to me, it is important that this turning point of interpretation and of perception has to be looked at differently. And we also have to take into account which parts of the population we look at. The elites perceive it very differently from large parts of the population. Of course, we can take just one day when a new flag is being hoisted, and this is the day that is being celebrated each year. So the change is being perceived as something that happened just that day. Then these processes are being loaded with significance and are being used. To me, it seems important that within the newly emerging national states, for large parts of the population, this single day is not part of their experience. For them, the development started earlier and lasted longer. The political movements, party politics, meant that, for example, in the British colonies, the processes started 12 to 15 years earlier than the day of independence. So the question is that in a nation state, different experiences and patterns of interpretation exist. And to come back to the second thing that you mentioned, different courses of events, indeed, independence and the days of independence, which the African political elites invite each other to, and they also mean that days of independence have to be celebrated on different days, dates in the different African countries, which was organized in that way because de Gaulle wanted to participate in the celebrations in all former colonies. So if we look at these processes, they started in the 1960s or even earlier. We can look at three different types of decolonialization processes. I've been working in Ghana for 30 years. In 1957, it was the first sub-Saharan state which became independent. It had strong political elites, particularly in the south of the countries. There were, for example, independent judges already in the end of the 19th century. And there, the question of party competition is a very important one. And this question remained important after the independence. However, in 1966, there was a coup d'etat. Other people would call it the end of Nkrumah's dictatorship. And there, the relation towards the former colonizer, Great Britain, is not a very critical one. But of course, the state tried to declare heroes of independence. Madagascar has a very different development. In 1947, there was a bloody uprising against the French, which was being concealed for a long time. This is an example of international entanglement of the actors, as Mr. Eckel also named it, namely that the French were afraid that things that happened in Indochina could be repeated in Africa. And that is why the uprising there was suppressed bloodily. And in the 60s, the state became independent in friendship, as it was called. And the elites, not the ones that were involved in the uprising, became part of the new political elites. Then in the 70s, again, there was a military dictatorship, then process of democratization. And the things that happened in 1947 are being remembered only today. A third example is Namibia. There, an armed fight for independence was being fought, but there were also negotiations. And at the end, the state became independent after long negotiations. However, in the narrative of the country, they became independent because of the struggle of their population, because they participated in the struggles. And this is something that is changing only today. So 3 very different examples of transformation processes. And all 3 examples are also examples of strong international entanglement and examples of the birth of new nation states. I think this will be enough for now.
I think it's particularly the question, who are the actors? What's the next steps, the elites? And remembering the actual events, those will be questions that will be important for the rest of our conference, to ask how justice can be created in these post-transformation societies. Latin America had its decolonization process or independence process much earlier. Also, we've had some very charismatic figures, but they go back to the early 19th century. Sabine, Kurtenbach, when we look at the 20th century and the system changes that have taken place then, what examples would be important? Yes, thank you. I think when we talk about Latin America, the first question is, does Latin America even exist? Latin America, like other regions, is very diverse. There are many profound differences, but I'd like to focus on the commonalities today, because especially when speaking about processes of system change or their lack, Latin American experiences are quite similar when we take a long-term perspective. In Latin America, the 20th century is characterized by prevented system changes in its first half and all the way to the late 1980s, which isn't to do with the East-West conflict, but which happened under the cover of the East-West conflict. Thinking back to the 50s, there were social progressive movements in Guatemala, for instance, or in the 70s in Chile. Those were put down or destroyed, not only, but also with the support of the United States. These are followed in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the third wave of democratization, where Latin America is playing a very strong role. Apart from Cuba and Mexico, Mexico took place a little later. Between the 70s, mid-70s and 1990, all countries of the region formally became democratic. Was that a system change? Yes, no, politically to some degree, I would say. That change, that democratization has opened up new options, especially for civil society, new room for maneuver. But at the same time, democratization did not really change anything with respect to the fundamental problems like inequality and that is why we are observing what has been called democratic backsliding in the debate. Even countries that were held up as models for democratization, like El Salvador, or countries that formerly were democratic for quite a while during the period of dictatorships in the 1960s and 70s, like Venezuela. Today, they're no longer really democratic, or at least have gone back to pretty authoritarian structures, or moving back towards such structures. Now, looking at possible reasons, I would say 2 factors play a crucial role. One is the transitions towards democracy in the 80s and 90s, were predominantly related to pacts. So governments and oppositions agreed. Two models of transitions that were negotiated. We can say similar things for the countries of Central America, where wars also went along with stronger democratization based on peace accords. These pacts are often celebrated as minimum consensus or a balancing mechanism between different interests, but they come at a significant cost. And in Latin America, that cost was that the old elites retained their economic power, certainly, and in part also their political power. Chile, also one of the celebrated models of democratization, also had some backslide. This became known more globally. The Pinochet supporters managed to develop an electoral system that preferred certain minorities to such a degree that they at least have a veto power. And the neoliberal economy has been written into the authoritarian, constitution, which is still a dictatorship, really. So the elites have managed to retain their power also in the new democratic states. And the second point is that formal democratization didn't change the structural problems. Latin America is still the region in the world with the greatest inequalities, and that means, of course, that the people reject democracy because it doesn't deliver. There was incredible hope, both in the context of peace processes and of the advent of democracy, that things really would change, but it didn't happen. And today, that means it opens doors to populists and demagogues, or people that we have seen plenty of in Latin America's history. And that leads to volatile situations. Peru is a current example where in elections an unknown primary school teacher from the uplands is putting himself up for election against the daughter of the former dictator Fujimori. So polarization couldn't be greater, really, in the region. So, maybe in the discussion we can come back to the question, what does that mean for reconciliation? What does it mean for how we deal with history? And there again, in Latin America, there are some very interesting experiences. Thank you. Okay, so hopes that were disappointed, that's something I'd like to come back to later in the context of how societies deal with the fact that expectations perhaps didn't materialize, weren't met. Maybe also because of continuities in these system changes. I'm sure that plays a great role, not just for how these events are remembered, but also how we deal with them. The last region for today is Southeast Asia, Eastern Asia. Aurel, Croissant, possibly a very different region because its culture is very different, question mark? Or would you say that what we've heard from the other three regions is also found in the region that you are interested in? Yes, thank you. It's maybe not very surprising that there are commonalities and differences. Because the region, at least with respect to the number of countries, the different societies, the number of population sizes is the biggest region that we're talking about today. I wouldn't want to speak of individual countries. I'd want to talk about groups of countries and groups of system changes in the recent past. And despite all the differences between the individual countries and regions, we can say, with a view to political regime changes in the late 20th and early 21st century, we can say that despite different starting points, different courses of events, and different results, 4 groups of countries can be differentiated. First of all, we have Taiwan and South Korea. They're twins almost in terms of system changes from a right-wing dictatorship to a parliamentary democracy. A second group is the Southeast Asian countries, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, where mass mobilization, also influenced by civil society actors, played a very important role, where, however, social problems linked to ethnic conflicts, linked to structural injustices, in particular also economic injustices, have led to situations similar to some Latin American countries, that these countries were very receptive to highly populist or anti-democratic instigators. The third group is Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan. They are similar with respect to structural inequalities, weak state rule, and the weak governments, basically, and weak public policies. That's it, which makes them susceptible to different types of anti-democratic rhetorics. And the fourth group, and it's worth mentioning it, despite Afghanistan, it's Cambodia and Timor-Leste, which is where the international community has sometimes more successfully, sometimes less successfully managed the process of democratization. But I want to name 3 commonalities between all these groups that might be particularly interesting for our conference. Resorting back to the introductory presentation of Mr. Eckel, I would agree that 1989 isn't really the year of transformation in the region, but I would say the phase between roughly the mid-80s and roughly the mid-90s. That's a decade in Pacific Asia where the end of the East-West confrontation and the end of the Cold War opened up structures of opportunity that enable democratization, i.e. the change from openly authoritarian towards more democratic governments. The end of the Cold War wasn't the cause of these processes of change, but it was an enabler, if you like, in all 4 groups of countries. Second point, the mix of continuity and change. Nearly all system changes in the region are characterized by a high degree of continuity of elites, so similar to Latin America. Unlike Eastern Europe, the system change mostly was limited to changes of political institutions. So it wasn't really new nations that arose. Of course, there are some exceptions like Timor, but we didn't have a change of the economic system either. So continuity with respect to the elites linked to system change in terms of institutions. That then has consequences for how these countries deal with the past. And transitional justice in the region is a difficult thing. That's on the one hand to do with the continuity of elites up and above the introduction of democratic institutions. But secondly, it's also linked to the fact that if transitional justice is talked about, if dealing with the past is even an issue in these countries, they don't normally mean looking at repressive regimes, authoritarian regimes. They're really talking about significant violations of human rights in the context of state formation, whenever that was. In South Korea, it was roughly in 1945 to early 50s. In Bangladesh, it was 1970, 71. So it's slightly different in terms of the temporalities there. But that then deeply intervenes in the construction of the country's founding myths, and that makes it so hard to deal with the past, really. Okay, what I'm noticing, just very briefly, I can see all 4 of you on my screen. So if you are keen to intervene, please just raise your hand. To refer back to what you are saying to each other, our colleagues who are sorting out the live stream will then make sure that you are in the picture. what's really important to me is the question of Carola, Lentz, Gwendolyn, Sasse touched upon this, how important domestic dynamics, social dynamics play a role, and how that should be weighed against the global international approaches. What is the role played by both of those? Because that will play a role in the context of asking, how do we remember this? How do we then reconcile ourselves with that past? Is that really our own reconciliation, or is it imposed, so to speak? Does it come from the outside? Thinking of the examples we talked about, how strong are the internal dynamics in those respective countries and societies, and how strong are the global dynamics? Who wants to go first? Lentz, okay. Yes, I'd like to add that our examples aren't a perfect fit, because I actually referred to the period of decolonization. We could have done the same for Southeast Asia, for Latin America. It wouldn't have made as much sense because we'd have to go back 200 years. Okay, but if it was a perfect fit, it would be too simple, wouldn't it? No, I just wanted to say, of course, there are the processes that Mr. Croissant has reported on for Southeast Asia. These same processes also exist in terms of regime changes that took place afterwards in Africa. I'd be interested to learn whether in South America, Southeastern Europe and Asia, whether it's all happening in a similar way. Let's take Ivory Coast. Okay, after 50 years of independence, we had Laurent Gbagbo tried a fairly radical regime change. And they did this by resorting back to the independence movement. They said, oh, dear people of Côte d'Ivoire, we didn't really have independence in the 1960s. We stayed in the Francophone context. We have remained France-Afrique, and what we need now is independence. So I see an interesting point there where history is always resorted back to, but by competing political elites. So one's own history of independence is resorted to, is referred to in different ways. So, and within a society that is split very often, polarized, that interpretation is very different of those original independence movements. There's probably parallels, isn't there? Ms. Kurtenbach.
Thank you. I think what is very important for Latin America is that the Cold War in Latin America hasn't ended yet. With Cuba and this example of Cuba and the confrontation between Cuba and the US and the acknowledgement that some social groups and political actors declare their support of Cuba or the US, the Cold War goes on. And in Venezuela, and against the background of the conflict with Venezuela, this Cold War has even intensified. And the debate is about who is guilty, responsibility for human rights violations, inequality, and so on. And in Latin America, we can see a continuity because almost all actors seem to support this polarization, and very few actors act beyond this process. And it is very difficult, and probably from my point of view, it is a central problem for the near future of Latin America, because many civil society actors want to bring about a change. For example, human rights defenders, they need this change and they want to participate in a change. And this maybe also differentiates Latin America from other regions. Mr. Croissant, you wanted to add something? Yes, Thank you. I've got 2 points. At first, I would like to answer your question, and then I would like to come back to the question of Mrs. Lentz. I will start with Mrs. Lentz. It is completely right for large parts of Asia, not for all of them, because some of them were never colonies. Taiwan, Japan, China was no colony, at least formally spoken. But in many countries, colonialism continues to play a role. And I think that the conflicts within South Korea, for example, cannot be explained without looking back to the colonial rule of Japan and what Mr. Eckel called the inner Korean civil war, so the conflict between communist and anti-communist nationalists. Similarly, in Bangladesh, failed processes of reconciliation and also the autocratization of a formal democratic order that happened in the 90s. This cannot be explained in Bangladesh without coming back to the different perception of the independence war of 1970 and 71 and the role of Islamic actors versus secularly oriented nationalists. So this plays a role in many countries, but not in all. Also in Taiwan, the White Terror, and only now, 30 years after the beginning of democratization, the claim of coming to terms with the dictatorship. Then the question about the mixture of national and international influences. Of course, the majority of the system change processes in Pacific Asia, inner societal actors and developments and interests and also structures set the parameters of the developments of the 80s and 90s. But international influence plays a role, of course, and I want to highlight that the old confrontation between the East and the West is gone, but the system confrontation is still there, although it has a different form now. It's no longer the conflict between a Marxist-Leninist, nationalist communism versus a Western anti-communism, but it's the system conflict between liberal democracy and market economy and a state capitalism as we can see it in China. So this is a conflict that we still see in the region, and this will also have an influence on the question autocracy versus democracy in the coming 10 years. Thank you. We received a question via the chat. We talked about international relations. How can the role of China being perceived as a guarantor for the stability of Southeast Asia? Does the Chinese leadership did it actively prevent system changes apart from its own country, or does the foreign policy of China still defensive? Neither the one nor the other. The Chinese foreign policy is no longer defensive. It is not necessarily aggressive. In the South China Sea it is, but in other parts of Asia it isn't. But it's no longer a defensive foreign policy. But we can't say for East and Southeast Asia that there is an active subversion of democratic structures in Southeast Asian countries. Some develop into the direction of an authoritarian regime, but not all of them are supported by China. We can't say that, but we can say that the Chinese government supports different authoritarian regimes of Southeast Asia and collaborates with them, and in this way supports them. For example, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar is a very current example. Maybe Afghanistan will become an example, but we can't say that China acts as a black knight in the region who actively strives to subvert democracies. I wouldn't say that at the moment. When I talked about the relation between international and national processes, Gwendolyn Sasse raised her hand, and there's one question in the chat about the international influence on the revolution in Central and Eastern Europe. Not only in view of Western Europe or the US, maybe there were also other international factors which played a role in these revolutions, and I would like to pass this question on to you. Yes, thank you. And I would like to come back to the question what we highlight in our analysis when we look at the system changes in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. I agree with the others in this panel. I would place the emphasis on society changes. There are political claims that are being phrased, but there's also processes that we can call modernization, which is not an unproblematic term. When we try to explain why in 1991 the Soviet Union collapsed, I would like to mention international factors as framework conditions. For example, that arms expenditures were a large burden for the Soviet budget. But I still think that developments within society played a larger role. After 1989 and 91, there were countries in which there were attempts to bring about a political change, and there the international players set the framework. These were actors from the neighboring states, which supported democratization. These were other Western countries that was present there. But we can also see examples where a change happened and other countries where there were no such framework conditions, but the change took place anyway. So the dynamics and the influence from abroad support events, but do not determine them. And if I may, I would like to come back to an aspect, and I would like to point out to an aspect that was reinforced by what the other participants said about their regions. Europe is a very large term. And if we talk about Europe, we sometimes also mean the former Soviet Union, which also includes Central Asia. And my experience shows that we should look at Europe as a more broad region. In the Baltic states, we don't see a continuity of elites and very much development from below. But when we talk about reconciliation and remembrance, we see that this remembrance is politically motivated, but it's very far from transitional justice. In Central Asia, nobody wanted independence. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the elites continued. In other countries, there are different cultures of remembrance. Yes, and what I just mentioned was that some countries of Eastern Europe would rather say that they are Central European countries and not Eastern European countries. The question is always where these regions orient towards. Carola Lentz, the floor is yours. I would like to name a comparing aspect about competing actors. When we look at independence movements and moments in Africa, then what we can see very strongly is they learned from Southeast Asia. And the people studied in the same cities in the 30s, 20s, 40s, and 50s. I think the same pertains to South America. There were cities as Paris, as London, but also Black universities in the US, for example, the Lincoln University, where these actors who later became politicians set up their networks and friendships, which then became important for the political developments in their countries. The empires watched each other and said, for example, we won't do as the Brits did, for example, or the French do what we did in Indochina must not be repeated in Madagascar. But what is new is that now communication media have changed. And I would say that since the 70s, there were already conferences, and since the 90s, the social media brought about new networks beyond the political elites, which means that solidarity movements from Hamburg, for example, can be influenced by what is being discussed in the US and vice versa, influence what, for example, happens in Namibia. So I don't know whether we can fix a certain point in time, but I think since the 90s, we see that narratives pass globally very quickly and bring about changes and upheavals and change former continuities. Mr. Eckel named the example of human rights, but this also holds true to other topics. And within this global discourse, there are very different views, the views of the elites, of different groups of society. And what I find very interesting is that regions play a smaller role. What happens in the US can become important for Africa, for Eastern Europe, and so on. Let me stop here. I think that things have changed in the past 30 years. Things have intensified and accelerated. Older networks, global networks are still existing, and that is why I would like to ask the question that was sent to me via email about the role of international institutions, in particular the role of churches, of religions in the system changes. Who would like to answer? Mrs. Kurtenbach. Thank you very much. This brings me back to the reconciliation process in Latin America. The Catholic Church and in parts also the Protestant church, not the evangelical churches, but the Protestant church in Latin America at the times of the military dictatorships played a large role, not only by ways of supporting the dictatorships, but also as organizations which supported human rights defenders and civil society actors. They protected them. The Catholic Church in many countries was a kind of umbrella under which these groups were able to meet and organize, not completely without danger, but in less danger. So the dioceses and the human rights organizations of the Catholic Church played an important role during the system changes. But just as with the pacts as a whole, reconciliation processes are impacted by the fact that there is a continuity of elites. In South America, we've got some well-known examples of churches documenting human rights violations. For example, this never again aspect in Argentina or the Chilean reports about the Salvador dictatorship or the remembrance about the silence in Guatemala. These are documents and reference points which are of utmost importance for civil society. Guatemala is an example where this official truth commission did not have enough legitimacy, and the Catholic Church did the same again. They talked to the same people in the same regions and wrote, I think, about 10 books about what happened at the same time. The criminal prosecution of these processes happened only in parts. Argentina was the first country where participants to the military elites were tried after the dictatorship, and the military in Argentina was able to consolidate its position under democracy only in parts. In other countries, there were attempts, and parts also successful attempts, of prosecuting perpetrators. Guatemala, I think, is the only country in which the perpetrators of a genocide were tried. However, the conviction of the perpetrators was reversed 10 days after. So, but this was just one example. And in the other countries, the elites were not interested at all in criminal proceedings and resisted them very actively. They tried to undermine the independence of courts and withdrew independence of courts. And one last sentence. At the moment, there is the process of establishing peace in Colombia. It is a very complex process, and it also promises a lesser conviction for participation in the process of reconciliation. There are hearings, there is a truth commission which carries out hearings, and both victims get the opportunity to ask questions to the perpetrators. This is a very difficult process, but I think it is one way of dealing with one's own past. Very close to the formal end of the war, and it is something that is happening only in this country. And it is very contested because violence against human rights defenders in Colombia is continuing. So the continuity of this reappraisal process is the bigger, the closer it is to the events itself. Maybe this is one of the reasons why in some regions these processes took longer.
That's an important point we have to come back to later, namely, what's a good point in time within a society to begin reconciliation processes? How much time do societies need to give themselves? Or how urgently do solutions need to be found? We still looked at the role of institutions in the process of system changes. We touched upon religion.
Ja, also aus Perspektive oder mit Blick auf meine Region ist natürlich.
Yes, I wanted to look at my region and broaden the perspective a little bit to the roles of religious authorities, because the Christian churches, of course, do play a central role in some of the countries, like the Philippines, but not everywhere. But religious authorities are important in both phases of system change that we've talked about. Firstly, in the phase of independence from Western colonial rule, or as carriers of anti-Japanese nationalism. Of course, there's good reason that Christian churches in Korea between 1910, 1912, expanded drastically because it was an instrument of nationalism. East Timor, at the point of its takeover by Indonesia, about a quarter of the population was Catholic. In 1999, it was 3/4 of the population. So that's a rise from 25% to 75%. And that's because churches were a symbol for national identity, from a symbol of Portuguese suppression all the way to a symbol of Timorese nationalism, because it was the only institution that allowed or represented this little part of an island internationally. So religious authorities play an important role. Very often, however, they're not Christian churches, like Catholic or Protestant congregations. They also tend to be other religious communities and other authorities. So with a view to reconciliation and transitional justice, they play a fairly minor role, we have to say honestly. Gwendolyn, Sasse. Yes, on the topic of religion, I wanted to refer to the first journey of Pope John Paul II, where he invited himself to the Soviet Union, more or less. I think the significance of that journey, that visit, and the international context this was placed in cannot be underestimated. A year later, Solidarność was founded, Poland. And the significance of that should not be underestimated. And that is then closely linked to the demands for change and also national identity. Those things already existed before, but it really was an important moment, which then was perceived beyond Poland, of course, as well. When we talk about Eastern Europe, generally the communist model was supposed to be a secular model. It wasn't everywhere, but particularly in the Soviet Union, in the Baltics, apart from the Baltic states and parts of Ukraine, it was. There were, of course, different religions. The Orthodox Church, very important. There was also Islam, but it was subordinate. Religious, again, with maybe some exceptions in the Baltic states and the Ukraine, where they were linked to opposition movements. Religion kind of adapted to what was there, and then gained some dynamism after the transition, after the change, but wasn't really a factor moving to supporting change. Carola, Lentz, how did the elites situate themselves in terms of their secularity in processes of change in Africa? And what happened then? Are there still secular discourses predominantly? Well, because missionaries have such a long history in Africa, the role of churches is much more ambivalent, I would say. It's much more heterogeneous, for a start. In the countries themselves, if we take an example like Ghana, you have all the various denominations and also local appropriations, local developments of those global churches. But also taking Namibia or South Africa as examples, it isn't the case that we could speak of liberation theology or a continuous role of the church supporting liberation movements, for example. In part, yes, in part, no. So there were also interreligious conflicts that were important. So I'm not entirely sure what role was played by the networks. The Protestant church globally was an important institution for the liberation movement in Namibia, but not the entire Protestant church. That's a rather differentiated institution. In other African countries, I'm not really sure when we look back at the historical period of colonialism. My northern Ghanaian research have shown that Catholics and priests actually warned the population to go for independence. They said, oh, this is supported by communists. It's a communist instigation. We have to be careful. So, yeah, I would say that maybe the church does not play a huge role in 1960s Africa for independence movements then. Maybe it plays a greater role in the movements that came along later, like South Africa, Namibia. So I would be cautious. I think other networks were more important than the church. Networks, for example, that arose because people studied together, Pan-African associations, for example, student associations, later the Union of Dog-Free Countries and so on. But I'm cautious because I see very heterogeneous conditions in the various countries. We touched upon the fact that we speak rather neutrally about system changes or transformations or shifts, but of course we are aware of the fact that opportunities for individuals might become greater as a consequence of such a change. It's not simply replacing one authoritarian regime with another. In the fields that you are working in, what would you say are the conditions under which something can succeed? Which is not to say it has to succeed. That's probably the $1 million question for system changes generally. Mr. Croissant had his hands up first, then Sabine Kurtenbach. Yes, my answer would would come in two parts. The first part is not very satisfying because there isn't the set of variables or the single variable that necessarily contributes to the success of system changes, moving from a authoritarian regime to a more participatory, more regime that maybe more democratic regime. So there isn't a single necessary or a single there's no single condition or factor, but there are constellations of factors, I would say, that make it easier or that enable the success of such changes. And there's also constellations of factors that make it harder to have such a change. And I would say that they vary between regions. Sabine Kurtenbach has already touched upon it. I would say for the transition itself, negotiated political solutions between the elites are probably more supportive than violent elements. Revolution. I mean, revolution is a great term. Because it is connotated rather positively here in Northern Europe, a democratic revolution, that sounds like social change, but in the context of democratic transformation processes, revolutions are often problematic because politics is taking to the street, and politics really is all about introducing institutions. So political processes need to come back to institutions. So elites that negotiate pacts or those agreements, they might be useful initially, but in the subsequent phase, when democracies have to be democratized, so to speak, then that becomes a problem because the transitions negotiated by the elites often then also contribute to catalyzing economic developments or political developments. So that's one factor. The other factor is the polarization of identity, of ethnic conflicts. Not ethnic diversity per se is an obstacle, I would say. It's the polarization of ethnic or religious identities. So that tends to be a hindrance, shall we say. A weak state is always bad for democracy, but a strong state can also be bad for democracies because a strong state can force the suppression of opposition, for example. But once the transition has been successful, let's say from authoritarian states to democracy, then actually state rule that works is an advantageous condition. I mean, if you want to organize a process of reconciliation, you need the ability somehow, the institutional ability, or to then create other institutions to offer possibilities for participation. So that means the state needs to have some agency at least. Okay, so those are some of my thoughts, but there's not a single factor that is inevitably then leading to success. Sabine Kurtenbach, I completely agree, really, but I'd like to give two examples. One is Colombia. Strictly speaking, that's a country that didn't experience a real system change because after 40 years of war, it was always formally a democracy. But we can see that democratization or the expansion of democracy is linked to two interrelated factors. One is, for the last 30 years, Colombia has had one of the most progressive constitutions of Latin America, which has made a huge contribution to strengthening basic human rights. That then meant that civil society, which had been active already, has expanded its room for maneuver, so to speak, has consolidated it over the last 30 years, despite rather unhappy circumstances. The war that continued and the fact that civil society actors were always a target of armed actors of the state and also not the state. So those are two factors that are important. Looking to other examples, Nicaragua, That's the example of a revolutionary system change. So you have a victorious revolution that leads to democratization, then leads to another war. So comparing that to El Salvador or Guatemala, where we had negotiated system changes or transitions, institutions, in particular security forces, the security forces, Nicaragua was the positive example. They didn't actually reform anything. They had a new police force, a new military force. They really were much more professional. They were apolitical. And who initially, at least, tried to guarantee the safety and security of the populations. But in the last 10 to 15 years, we also observe a process in Nicaragua that is regressing on all of that, that is destroying all of this. So that means in Nicaragua today, we are back in a situation like in 1979. Again, we have a family dynasty in power that suppresses opposition, that is repressive, and that stops every sign of civil change. And El Salvador and Guatemala are in a similar on a similar journey back into the 70s. So those are these processes of toing and froing, and what Mr. Eckel said earlier really spoke for me. We need to look at the long term. Where were oppositions for change, and where were opportunities for sustainable change that doesn't just happen at the formal level? So what are the conditions for substantive change that actually does work on the fundamental conflicts? Yes, I'll come back to the longue durée in a moment. Gwendolyn, Sasse first. Yes, I mentioned the example of Belarus and what's been going on there since last August. Even though I agree that there isn't a single recipe, I would say we can observe important elements that are necessary in order to establish a democratic system or democratic system of change. Sorry, we're not seeing those in Belarus. So one key moment is whether key elites would go for the uncertainty of a transition or whether they stay loyal to the regime. And these tend to be key elites in politics, but certainly also from the security apparatus. We haven't actually spoken much about the role of the military in the different regional contexts. That also, of course, is important. But there we see an example that despite mass mobilization, which is really rare in the way we've been observing over the course of a certain period, against the background where civil society, or at least the sense of a nation, is only just growing, is forming actually in front of our eyes. So that institutional feedback wasn't actually there previously. And we can see that this alone, this sort of drive is not enough. So the key elites are very significant. And that's why, of course, the idea of the pact between the elites is important. When both sides notice, it's not necessarily to do with democracy, when they realize we can't pursue our interests, then that, and we have to come together, we need to negotiate, then that might lead to democracy, but it doesn't necessarily lead to that. In East and Central Europe, it's been really difficult to come to those pacts. There were round tables in the past, but they didn't last very long, so they are not comparable maybe to Latin America. But I just wanted to really emphasize the role of key elites to weigh their risks. Carola Lentz, she typed a lot, then she raised her hand, then she took down her hand. But I think you want to come in, do you?
Yes, I can add something. And when we talked about the conference in advance, we talked about the colonial era. Now we are talking about a different topic, about system changes and upheavals in the post-colonial area. But what is interesting is that in Africa, we are in a comparable situation as Latin America, because there was a wave of democratization in the 90s, and now we see in many places that democracy comes to an end. Let us think of Mali, Niger, Congo. And there is a very vivid debate within the African intellectual, among intellectuals and politicians, but also external observers. What part of history is responsible to the failure of the state, of also for successful examples, as for example Ghana, which has a relatively stable democracy. So where do we have to look in order to find the factors influencing a failure or success of a state? I agree with my predecessors. We have to look at the longue durée of the processes. Of course, it is a very popular blame game to say that communism is guilty, and it showed all scenarios such as state capture for own political and economic gains and so on. And this all happened already in the times of colonialism. But we find countries such as Ghana or some other where we have a long state tradition also before colonial times. And at the end, I think we have to look at how the social contract between society and the state is being organized. And there are different examples in Africa and Latin America, and these examples go back into history. I think that not everything that happened in pre-colonial times has an influence on what happens now. This is a very popular task of political scientists to look at what happened in the 18th and 19th century. And those countries which were no states before the 19th centuries are not able to be successful states now. I think this is not true. But what is important in terms of remembrance work is that the moment of independence is very often perceived as the moment of grand promises by the nation, and is being repeated when people claim political change. We are independent, and this also means that we have to take our fate into our own hands. And we can't blame colonialism for some things that don't work now, that the administration is ineffective and so on. There are others who say that the independence was appropriated by the political elites for selfish reasons and is being instrumentalized, and we have to become more participative. Their indigenous traditions are being celebrated, and many countries claim that older ways of participation have to be revitalized. But there is a very vivid debate, and people very often recur to the moment of independence and say that with the moment of independence, people believe that things will become better. This is interesting because such historic moments, which happened some 60 years ago, is being referred to again and again in order to legitimize political movements and to support political processes and to claim political rights. And at the same time, we have this long duration and say that independence processes looked very differently in countries which already had an established function in administration. Different from those countries where the colonial rule was a system which did not try to establish a functioning state in the regions. So there are very many different approaches. All four of you said that both are true, but I would like to come back to Mrs. Lentz. This question of looking back to pre-colonial history and older states. Does this play a role in the moment of regime change, or is it something that comes back when it comes to legitimizing processes later on? We heard the example of Ukraine, and the question is, when was the nation-building process of Ukraine finished, and in how far do they also refer to the older history? Does this history play a role at all? And did it play a role at the time of the upheavals, or is it something that is used only after these changes took place? You asked me directly. There are many examples, as for example, Madagascar, where at the moment of independence, people said before the French colonialization, we were an independent state, and now we regained our independence. This is the narrative of Madagascar that started to play a role already in the 60s. But in no case in Africa, and also not in Madagascar, did the newly gained independence and the new nation state identical to the states that existed before colonialism. So the Merina Kingdom is the state that existed in parts of today's Madagascar, but that was a state that participated in slave trade, for example. And in the 60s, people asked, can we really refer to this Merina Kingdom as a predecessor of our independent state if we want to integrate the population at the coast, which became victim to slave trade? And the same can be found in Ghana. There was the Ashanti Kingdom, and I work in the north of the country, and everybody there would say we were the slaves of the Ashanti. So Ghana is not a reincarnation of the Ashanti Kingdom, but it is an example of where, for example, also the name Ghana. At first, the country was called Gold Coast, and then new territories were integrated, and Ghana, today's Ghana, is not situated exactly within the borders of the historical Ghana. And it is a country which constructs its history and which contains parts and integrated migrants from other parts of Africa. So pointing to pre-colonial times contains a lot of potential for discussion and debate. Gwendolyn, Sasse, would you like to continue? Yes. In the Baltic states and in Central and Eastern Europe, people concentrated on the recent past. The independence between the wars was the logical point of reference, which also served as an argument. And it was connected to independence. In Central and Eastern Europe and in the Baltic states, people also oriented towards Europe. Maybe you remember the essay of Kundera, "We Are Europe." The people wanted to shake Europe and remind Europe that they played a role in Europe earlier. And so the point of reference was the one that was closest. But of course, people look back into further history. For countries as Ukraine, the situation is more complicated. In those parts of the Soviet Union which wanted to become independent, these countries wanted to become sovereign states. This was an aspiration of secession and not of independence, because the Soviet Union was a union of sovereign states on the paper, and the countries or the parts of the Soviet Union wanted the sovereignty to become stronger. And this is also something that dissidents supported and dissidents referred to. In Ukraine, there were no large territories which were sovereign or independent earlier. And what played an important role for them was independence of taking decisions. Today, Ukrainians look back at a history that is not as well reflected. And we know that from Poland as well. There are institutes of national remembrance. There are laws of remembrance that prescribe certain ways of remembrance and scientific work on history, and which also say that other ways of interpreting the past can even be punished. So if you question, for example, the heroism of the Great Patriotic War, you can be sued for that. And this legislation is very popular in Central and in Eastern Europe. Mrs. Kurtenbach. In Latin America, the situation is different. I think that the indigenous population was decreased significantly during colonialism. And we can see that the upheaval, the regime change, creates a space for action. So we can see large indigenous movements and mobilizations in countries which have at least a significant minority of indigenous people. In Ecuador, indigenous peoples toppled 3 presidents with the help of protests. And we know the picture of Evo Morales, who had his inauguration not in the president's palace, but on a holy mountain in Ecuador. And this is one thing. So there are actors which instrumentalize this. Evo Morales is not the indigenous leader that he wants to be or presents himself. And the other thing is how Latin America deals with the deficits of democratization. Many indigenous groups are being marginalized, and the concept of good life in Latin America is used for indigenous groups, and such politicians as Rafael Coer refer to the indigenous peoples as a counter model to the current economic development. Some countries, such as Chile, are successful democracies today, and there are indigenous groups which were suppressed by the governments, also by some democratic governments. And now a member of the Mapuche is a member of parliament. This plays a role. And some indigenous people did not participate in elections, for example, and play a role in the formation of majorities. And these are processes that are very large and very interesting. Aurel, Croissant. For Southeast Asia, I can't answer this question very easily. Basically, I can say that there were some historical processes which played a role when creating a nation, and in the process of nation building. This can strengthen the social cohesion of societies and can lead to a successful dealing with the past. But this can also have very terrible consequences and differs. Just to present some contrasts, we've got Korea, South Korea, a country which has been a centralist state for 600 years. It was a homogeneous country in terms of language and more or less also in terms of religion. And this, of course, creates a social cohesion, which made it easier to reappraise crimes committed by the military dictatorship after 1980. And Indonesia is a different example. It was an independent state only between 1910 and 1930. And the state as it exists today is the result of a Dutch colony. And the idea that an Indonesia existed before the 19th century, the 20th century, is simply not true. And so there were only about 30 years when this country was a country. So things can be very different.
The good thing is that the questions we receive for the first panel can be passed on to the second panel. For example, would you agree that the significance of transformation of 1989 and 91 and its contradictions should be given more significance in education? Question mark. That also applies to other regions we've been looking at. The questions that we cannot deal with right now is what is the role that was played by feminist policy? What's the role played by gender in all of these processes? That would also be a very interesting panel. But I did promise earlier that to conclude, and of course we wanted to enter the coffee break on time for all of those who've been watching attentively. So the last 3 to 4 minutes, I'd like to ask you for a brief review. So when is the right time? What's the right point in time for us to actually begin this process of reconciliation? What might be a topic right away? What might happen after 1 generation? And what might be necessary after 2 generations? What makes sense when? Who wants to start? Carola, Lentz. Yeah, I think it follows on quite nicely from what I said earlier. I think the first thought is that these remembrance topics actually shift and change over time and can be rethought, can be reconfigured. If we use Namibia as an example, we can see that it needs the distance of a generation to actually touch upon some human rights crimes of the struggle generation. It's only now that they can even be talked about, but they don't feature yet at all in the national narrative. That narrative has grown. The role of civil society during the transitional phase is now a topic. Many more groups that had a part to play in the liberation struggles are now also topics of conversation, not just the fighters. But all those who have been classed as collaborators have been excluded, and those that were stigmatized, persecuted, and were killed are also excluded, still 30 years, 40 years after the fact. But, and that's important to make that difference, there we're talking about government-organized, official and policy of remembrance, which is anchored broadly, nevertheless. So we're not talking about memories in families or alternative associations where even those who have been brandished as collaborators, there are attempts to bring their memories back into the national narrative, to inscribe those memories in that narrative. So very heterogeneous landscapes of remembrance. I do think it does need some historical distance, and it needs stable political relations so that we can talk about certain things that have often been suppressed. Okay, I'm not rushing you because I want to drink coffee, but because we need to do the next technical check. Mr. Eckel, he also wanted to respond. By the way, the chat is accessible. You can read along if you like, but Sabine Kurtenbach first. Yes, very briefly, I would agree. Ms. Lentz, I would say a good point in time depends on the relations of on power relations. A revolutionary government can focus on certain crimes. When there's a pact, it makes that slightly more difficult. I think it also depends on the strength and organization of civil society groups. It depends on human rights organizations.
An sehr interessante Erfahrung hat, ist das in den Ländern, wo es auf
in Latin America, where it wasn't possible at a national level, regional human rights instrument was a way of circumventing it. So the regional court for human rights, it doesn't have much power, but symbolically speaking, for the narratives, it plays a huge role because their cases can be negotiated and can be decided that cannot be brought to national courts, but somehow fall through the cracks of institutions and power relations. So again, we need to broaden our perspective and not just look at national discourses of remembrance, but focus on the role of regional and international processes. In Spain, for example, Spain played a hugely important role in Guatemala and Chile because of the indictment of Pinochet and Prios Montt, the former general. It didn't lead to anything, but the symbolic level we shouldn't underestimate. Ms. Sasse, 2 sentences. Mr. Croissant, 2 sentences. Yes, I also wanted to agree. In addition to political stability, it needs a democratic context in order to achieve what we might call reconciliation with the past. Otherwise, it's very fragmented what happens, and what we see is that the victims of communism, you can follow on from that very quickly in all parts of Eastern Europe, not everywhere, but in most parts, under that term of independence and independence movements, a lot of things are ignored, and there's even legislation that supports the honor of the independence movements. So I think it needs that context. It needs distance, yes, historical distance, and a democratically stable context. But in the regions we talked about today, but globally everywhere, I would say, the challenge is to take multiple perspectives. There are good examples from Europe, like Polish and Ukrainian historians, how they started conversations, but that's still a difficult issue. Okay, Croissant, you have the last word. Yes, I agree with everything the colleagues have already said. Secondly, I'd like to add that dealing with the past and reconciliation are ongoing processes. When those processes start, that depends on the context, but they're never finished. Okay, well, our conversation also never really finishes. We do need to come to an end right now. Thank you very much. Now we go into the coffee break and we are back at 6 o'clock.